The UCP Convention was held in Calgary recently. To talk more about it is the Alberta correspondent for the National Post and our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson. Tyler, parents were declared the preeminent stakeholders in education policy. This was by far the most controversial resolution.
That's right. So there were a whole pile of resolutions, some of them on sort of the governance side, like whether or not boards of directors should be allowed to run as candidates, things like that, internal party stuff. And then there were all sorts of policy resolutions, and people will remember from the last time around that there were some controversies here with things like gay-straight alliances in schools. That was not so much the case this time, and as you say, the exception to some extent was a couple of the education policies. In large part, it was this one where they said parents are the preeminent stakeholder. Now, a lot of the objection to this it was over very Bill Clinton in its way. It was over the use of the word the. So are parents the stakeholder, or are they one of the stakeholders? Now, the people that opposed the motion said that no, well, actually, education's about the children. The children are actually the preeminent stakeholder, and parents are just one of them. And it was controversial because some of the people seemed to think this was sort of a backdoor into some of the GSA stuff. One speaker stood up and said, look, the NDP is going to attack us over this. Why do we want to go down this road again? We're giving ammunition to our opponents. And then someone else shot back and said, well, I'm sick and tired of the NDP dictating our policies and dictating what we can have as a policy and what we can't. And there were actually some boos and some jeers for that one. And the moderator had to calm everyone down and say, this person's a member of the party. They get to say their piece. So that motion, that policy resolution did pass. But that was certainly the main time I would say that we saw a little bit of tension over the weekend when discussing party policy.
Now, a resolution in favor of the Canada Health Act failed. Is this an attack on public health care?
Well, a critic could perhaps spin it that way. Now, there were a couple sort of labor folks on Twitter doing that over the weekend, but this actually wasn't super controversial. Some people spoke in favor of it, saying that healthcare is important, it is an Albertan value, things like that. But the people who are objecting to it were saying that, look, the Canada Health Act is an invasion of provincial jurisdiction, and this and that and this and that. So that one was reasonably close, if I recall correctly, and but it did not pass. So it was an interesting one, though, that, something like that, you sometimes think that ought to be a slam dunk, but it was a little bit controversial, and it didn't pass. And it remains to be seen, I think, to what extent these resolutions will become political footballs. They don't really seem to have in the last few days or so. Maybe that's just because there's so much else going on that they've got enough ammunition to go after the government as it is.
What's interesting, too, I was reading a recent tweet by NDP leader Rachel Notley, and she wants to challenge Premier Jason Kenney to a healthcare discussion. What have you been hearing about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, that is the big angst right now around the legislature and around parts of Alberta. Certainly, it's looking like there are going to be some not insignificant cuts made in sort of frontline healthcare workers. Now, this was one of the things that sort of the UCP promised wasn't going to happen in a way, but of course, they're not writing these budgets. They're not deciding who to lay off, I think is, one of the issues at hand here. It's not Jason Kenney going into the hospitals and, laying off nurses. So this is, a road that is likely to be trodden in the next little while. And Rachel Notley is upset about it. The unions are upset about it. There's been murmurs of a general strike. We've talked about this a lot over the last 6 months, I would say, you and I, that the unions are girding for battle with the government. And it's going to get worse before it gets better I'd be quite comfortable making that prediction, I think.
Now, something else I wanted to chat with you about, Tyler, is something that was shot down recently by the education minister received some discussion, the voucher system in education. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, so the voucher system seems to sort of have this cloud over it a little bit because of its affiliations with the United States. The same amount of money would be set aside per child, regardless of whether or not they are in a public school, private school, or homeschooled. So the idea is that those who choose, shall we say, alternative forms of education get, sort of more money. But this is similar to the parental stakeholder one in the sense that there are people who are very, very passionate about education as an issue. And I don't have children myself, so I must admit it's a little bit beyond my understanding, but it is one of those issues that really motivates a segment of the UCP base and a segment of the Conservative base. And, Jason Kenney has been trying to say that there's a grassroots guarantee, that they're listening to the grassroots. And there was a minor flare-up over whether or not that was the case some months ago. And this, I think, could be another one of those where delegates, many delegates in favor of something, and then the education minister is saying, well, that's just not going to happen. Some things maybe being nice policy, but make for pretty difficult politics down the road, perhaps.
Some protesters actually showed up at the UCP AGM and they marched around the hotel. They did their singing, their chanting, while UCP members just kind of kicked back and chilled.
Yeah, it was the protest kicked off quite early in the day. I mean, I got in at about 10 o'clock probably to start watching the resolutions, and gosh, people were parked, like a mile away from the venue, walking up with their signs, and there were, lots of them circling around, chanting, and as they do. It was terribly cold, so you got to give it to protesters, man. They'll go out in any weather sometimes.
Yeah.
But all was reasonably calm. A group of protesters did manage to get inside Saturday evening, and that's they sort of came into the lobby, and folks were milling around, chatting and having drinks, and that's when they sang some of their songs, and then departed with no major incident. Rick McIver, the transportation minister, said they welcomed some unexpected carolers. So that was maybe a little bit of the high drama for the weekend there.
If there's no tailgate parties going on with football games, why not go out there with your buddies and have fun and keep warm, right? Now, overall,
Exactly.
Premier Kenney called the UCP annual general meeting a huge success, and you say this is really a sign of a mature party.
I would say so. I think the fact that we did not see any major controversies it really does suggest that the party is either lining up behind Kenney or lining up behind their platform. I mean, they're still riding a wave, I think, from the election. So I would say they are very much settling in. But I mean, I think that the other thing to keep in mind is that there are the segments of the Conservative Party that Conservative leaders generally want to keep out of the spotlight, whether that's people who are pro-life, whether that's education advocates, whether that's whatever. There are, I think, segments that, for better or worse, cause a little bit of trouble for party leaders. And these people are patient. I think that is one of the reasons why social conservatives have actually made up a lot of ground in the United States over the years, is because they've been very, very, very patient. So it could be that, the controversies still lie ahead of the UCP. I think that's totally possible. But what I saw this weekend suggested a very, cohesive and confident party. And, after the victory in the spring, I think that's not a total surprise.
Well, if you want to move forward, definitely as a party, you have to be unified here, right? So federal Tory leader Andrew Shearer gave a speech. How well was it received? Did he get a lot of support from the UCP faithful?
Speaking of unity issues, yeah. So as viewers will know, he's been just attacked on all sides by his counterparts in the federal party and staffers and former party members. It's been a real mess for him. So, I think he was looking for a win when he showed up in Calgary. If a conservative leader can't come to Calgary and get standing ovations and big cheers, I mean, it's game over. And he was received, I would say, relatively warmly. A few people walked out. There were rumors of a mass protest that, hundreds of people were going to walk out. That did not materialize. Everyone was quite polite. He got a couple standing ovations. It by no means was a barn burner speech, but it was a polite reception. And on that front, I mean, Jason Kenney was asked about this at our closing press conference, and he told reporters, look, unity is a danger to the conservative movement. And I think I've said this to you before, and I've been saying it for a while now, that the Conservative Party does not want to be in the wilderness like it was in the 1990s. It does not want to be in the wilderness like the Liberal Party was for the last 10 years. So, and Jason Kenney sort of said the same thing, that he stands behind Shearer to avoid this sort of internal fighting that could cause big problems.
Now let's chit-chat a bit about the Fair Deal panel, Tyler. The government is getting a lot of input from locals. What's the main message? Is it all about cash? We need more money?
This is partly. So there's 9 separate things that they are looking at, and I won't rattle them all off here, but they vary from Alberta pension plan to having an Alberta provincial police force to having a firearms officer. There's a bunch of them. So yeah, the first one was Tuesday night in Edmonton, and it was quite interesting because critics have looked at the Kenney government and all of their public consultations and said, this looks like you guys are just giving cover. You're appointing these panels, and they're going to come back with recommendations that are going to allow you to do what you want. But actually, the other night in Edmonton, it was not totally in favor of these 9 ideas that the UCP is putting forward. There were quite a few people who stood up and said, look, Alberta's getting a great deal. Incomes are way higher here, and things like that. So it was quite interesting. Now, Edmonton, of course, not being the sort of diehard conservative city that other places in the province are. But, the panel, it's got Preston Manning on it, Stephen Lougheed, descendant of Peter Lougheed. So they heard from about 30 people over the course of the evening, mostly quite polite, only a couple of separatists. I would say a handful of people who felt that Alberta had a fair deal, or who felt that there wasn't much on the list that was worth picking from. And so it was quite an interesting night. I think all the reporters that were there expected it to be this separatist shouting match, and wasn't that at all. It was like quite a mature, sedate meeting in some ways.
It's interesting how you bring up, Edmonton's not as conservative as other ridings, but at the same time, I'm thinking back to the federal election. It was a Tory sweep, except for one seat was NDP, not Liberal, and it was in Edmonton, right? So
isn't that the truth? And my riding, as a matter of fact, has a Conservative federal member of Parliament and an NDP member of the legislature. So
wow,
go figure.
Well, even here in Lethbridge, we've got an NDP MLA and we've got a Conservative MLA, so we're kind of split here as well. Now, a new Leger poll says Premier Jason Kenney's popularity may be slipping a little bit. You have the details on that.
Yeah, so it's dropped to about 42% of people who are, who are really backing him and feeling positively about it. And this is down from about 60 back in September, when that was sort of the last time there was major polling out. So that's on paper that's a big jump. Now, for what it's worth, these are different polling firms. It was Angus Reid back in September that was saying 60%. So those sorts of factors can matter as well. And I'd written a little bit recently about Jason Kenney's popularity and how, he's just come off a bad month. I think, objectively speaking, he's had a rough month, from some of the spending stuff to Bill 22, where the elections commissioner was canned. He's had a rough go of it, and so I don't think it's a surprise that he has dropped in popularity, especially now that things like pensions are being talked about, things like healthcare cuts. These are tough spots for any politician, no matter how popular. But I think the important thing is we are early in this government, and I think probably Jason Kenney is savvy enough to know that if he's going to take a major hit in his popularity over something that really difficult like healthcare cuts, it's probably best to get that out of the way early, because he's got a lot of time to rebound before the next election.
Absolutely. Public sector union bosses have been throwing the word strike around, Tyler.
Mm-hmm.
Premier Kenney says he wants the unions to come forward in a spirit of collaboration, and says Albertans who are struggling mightily financially in places like Calgary and Red Deer may not be so sympathetic.
Yeah, so some of the unions are asking for things like an 8% pay increase, which is a lot and looks like a lot, but a lot of them been flat for a considerable number of years. So, but still, you see something like that, and you see your friends and family having to cut back, and that doesn't go over well. So I think the UCP is banking in large part on people not being super sympathetic with the demands from public sector unions. Now, they are, I think, trying to massage this a little bit and say that we do value the public sector. They are partners in having a more efficient government. But as you mentioned, Kenney said, look, we don't want to be in a sort of a general strike situation. We want the unions to work with us and meet somewhere in the middle, and so on and so forth. Which we will see if that happens. I think that sounds all fine and good, but I think to some extent it misunderstands what unions are there for, and they aren't there to make everyday Albertans feel good. They aren't there to make the Premier feel good. They're there to do whatever they can for their members, and sometimes that's really unpopular.
The Council of Confederation wrapped up with the Premier's meeting in Toronto recently, and Premier Kenney secured an agreement on relief from federal transfers for our province, and the Premier's pushed for reforms to Bill C-69, which is good news for our energy sector.
Yeah, so these are some of the things that Jason Kenney had pushed for back in July at the last Council of the Federation, which was in Saskatoon. And he had some difficulty, I should say, obtaining agreement. And he seems to have gotten some agreement on this. Now, what that will look like in the future is hard to say. I certainly think that the federal government has shown some willingness on Bill C-69 to rethink it a little bit. Do we see it reopened fully? Maybe not. Do we see it scrapped fully? I suspect not. But, this is one of the challenges for Jason Kenney, or pardon me, for Justin Trudeau going ahead, is he does have a coalition of conservative premiers who represent huge swaths of the country, and he is going to have a difficult time in a minority government situation to not look at what the premiers are saying and pay close attention to it, I think. So we will see what comes of that, but certainly the Alberta government's feeling pretty good about that from what I've been hearing this week.
And speaking of the energy sector, it sounds like pipe will finally be laid by Christmas for the Transmont pipeline expansion. Should be completed by the year 2023. And Tyler, it'll triple the capacity of getting our products to market, so that's good news as well.
Excellent news. And earlier this week, Enbridge's Line 3 came online for the Canada portion of it. So it's actually been a decently good news week for pipeline politics. As you say, these construction on TMX they were hoping to have got this underway ages ago. But yes, by Christmas, they're hoping to be putting pipe in the ground. There is another court challenge coming up so goodness knows what could happen there. This is whether or not the pipeline approvals process was again good enough. So we are not out of the water yet. But again, very positive noises coming from the province this week. They're feeling quite good about this.
Our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, joining me from Edmonton. Thanks so much, Tyler.
Thanks so much.